Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of Mr. Windsor Teaching World War II. Over this unit, we've been talking about the war itself and a few of the key events in World War II itself. A couple of lessons ago, we talked about the Battle of Britain, where Germany tried to attack through France into Britain, but first had to try and take out the British RAF, the Royal Air Force. Due to changing their strategy, they changed it right at the last minute to focus on major cities, which gave the RAF a chance to recover. So they failed to take over Britain on the Western Front, and then they tried to take over Stalingrad on the Eastern Front, again due to a last-minute change in strategy, and were ultimately defeated by the Russian army. So failing on both the Western and Eastern fronts, I'm sure you can probably tell at this point that the war is nearly over for Nazi Germany. In last lesson, however, we talked about D-Day, which is where Britain and all the Allies began to push the Nazi Germans back through France towards Germany again, and then onto the capital city of Berlin. What I'd like you to do, ladies and gentlemen, before we start this lesson, is just to recap what you already know about D-Day. So do a little mind map on a piece of paper that you may have to hand or on a blank page in your booklet. I'm going to give you 5 minutes in order to do that. Give yourself 5 minutes. Let's look at some of the key concepts, some key events of D-Day, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so here we go. So D-Day happened on 5 different beaches. Before they landed, they tried to make sure, and they were successful in giving Germany the wrong information. So they thought that the Allies would attack further north, leaving the beaches at Normandy not as heavily guarded as they might have been had they known. This led to an eventual success, but not without a few thousand casualties on the first day of the D-Day landings. It happened over 5 different beaches. They were Gold and Sword, which were predominantly British soldiers. There was Juno, which was French, Canadian, New Zealand, and Australian soldiers. And then there was Utah and Omaha beaches as well, with predominantly American soldiers. Omaha Beach was the one with the largest number of casualties on the D-Day landings. So first of all, Britain and the Allies tricked Germany. So that's what's represented by this little bunny in a hat. It's a magic trick through giving false information. They created, believe it or not, inflatable tanks so that when the Germans saw them from the air, they thought that the British would be attacking at a certain point, while the British actually focused their attack further south from where the Germans thought it would be. One of the key strategies was to send in paratroopers. Now, these were highly specialized soldiers with parachutes behind enemy lines who would blow up and explode key targets. Next came the planes, who again would be dropping some bombs on key targets. That is when the boats would come along and drop loads of soldiers onto Omaha and Utah beaches. Unfortunately, however, that resulted in the deaths of about 2,400 soldiers on the first day. If you wanted a little bit more perspective on what the D-Day landings looked like, you could always look at the first few minutes of the film Saving Private Ryan. After the D-Day landings, there were now about 150,000 soldiers on the northern coast of France, and more arriving every moment. And from there, they'd be able to push back the Nazi German army back through France and into Germany to stage the final attack. The soldiers now on the beaches were a mix of different nationalities. They were British, they were Australian, they were New Zealand, they were Canadian, they were American, and some French as well. So what we're seeing now is a time lapse on my screen now is a time lapse of the Battle of Normandy. What we're seeing is cluster of dots over here. The blue, the yellow, and the red are all Allied soldiers. So people from Britain, USA, Canada, France, New Zealand, Australia, those kind of areas. And the black dots signify the Nazi German army. So what we see gradually is that the soldiers spread out, some go up to the north, the rest of them down towards the south, pushing back the German army, now getting very much quicker, and then across France and into Germany there towards the end. So at this point, they pushed the German army back through France. Okay, so that's our review of D-Day done. Let's now push on to the topic of today's lesson. So what are we going to be learning about today? The persecution of Jewish people, and other minorities in Nazi Germany. Yes, most of the victims of the Holocaust were Jewish, about 6 million of them. However, there were lots of other minorities involved in that mix as well. Why? We're going to analyze the origin and result of anti-Semitism in Germany, and why now? We're going to discover where anti-minority feelings generally might lead to. This is often held up as an example of sort of anti-Semitism and racism. If you allow it to get too out of hand, then perhaps what happened in Nazi Germany at this point is kind of the stereotypical example of where that endpoint might be. Okay, so gradually, over the course of World War II, it got progressively worse for Jewish people inside Germany. It becomes very obvious when we read the sort of laws that were passed during this time, and you'll be able to see a sort of pattern as we go. So in 1933, all Jewish lawyers and judges and teachers sacked. So no Jewish lawyers, judges, or teachers allowed. All Jewish people banned from sports clubs in 1933. In 1934, all Jewish shops marked with a Star of David. So all shops have to carry the emblem of their religion so that all the Germans know that that is a Jewish shop. What that means then is that it's very easy to identify them, and then German people can purposely not go into those shops. 1935, something called the Nuremberg Laws were introduced, which meant that Jewish people were not allowed to vote despite participating in the society. They're not allowed to have a say in the way that society is run. Marriage between Jewish people and non-Jewish people is banned under the Nuremberg Laws. 1936, Jewish people not allowed to own any electrical equipment, including cameras and typewriters. No Jewish people are allowed to have or ride bicycles. 1938, all Jewish doctors sacked. All Jewish people to add the name Israel or Sarah to their first names, again making it very, very obvious which among the German populace are the Jewish people. All Jewish passports stamped with a red J, again identifying them, marking them out, making them seem as if they're not supposed to be there. And Jews ordered to register all of their wealth and property. They have to say to the German government what they own. Jewish people banned from German schools. Okay, so segregation. So there are Jewish schools and there are German schools now kept separate from each other. In November of the same year, Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, happens. Now, because Jewish shops are all marked with a Star of David, the emblem of their religion, it's now very, very easy for German people to begin rioting and attack only Jewish shops. The Jewish homes, synagogues, which is the Jewish temple, and businesses are all attacked and wrecked. 100 Jewish people are killed, 20,000 of them are sent to concentration camps. Now, concentration camps we'll learn a little bit more about later on in the lesson, but it's essentially a big camp where Jewish people are kept in horrid conditions. Many people die while waiting there. 1939, Jews can be evicted from their homes for no reason. Jews not allowed out of their homes between 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. Once war starts, Jewish people are rounded up into ghettos where they are forced to work. So certain areas of cities are now enclosed with walls, a couple of neighborhoods in diameter, and all of the Jewish people are put into those ghettos. Interestingly enough, we still use this word ghettos. I'll get onto that in a little bit later on in today's lesson. With the invasion of Russia, many Jews were hunted down and executed by special Einsatzgruppen soldiers. So to you and me, that would mean the SS, the stormtroopers, who were highly trained, were given automatic weapons, and had no moral issues with gunning people down in their hundreds. 1942, Nazi leaders met somewhere at something called the Wannsee Conference, and the final solution is agreed. Jews were to be rounded up and systematically exterminated. So there we have a list of laws passed in Germany. Pretty dastardly stuff. It starts with a bit of a slow burn and then escalates very, very quickly. Okay, so what I'd like you guys to do, ladies and gentlemen, is you're going to now create a living graph, I suppose this is called. So along your x-axis, there's one that goes along, you're going to have the year, and along your y-axis, you're going to have the sort of level severity of that law. Okay, so you're going to use the laws on the previous slide, and you're going to map them onto this graph. So for instance, if I think that Jewish homes, synagogues, and businesses attacked is a very, very serious issue. So 1930, I think that's a very serious issue. I'm going to use my pen or my pencil, 1938, and I think that's quite severe. So I'm going to put this event here, and I'm going to write what that event is next to it, because I believe that's very, very severe, and it's around 1938. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to give you a decent chunk of time. That's going to take a bit of time to do that, at least 10 or 15 minutes. Of course, once you're done, you can unpause your video. So please pause your video and get on with that now. Okay, so that's quite an interpretive task. It's no real way of me to say whether or not you are right or wrong. So hopefully you put an X depending on what year it happened and how severe it was. Perhaps what you've noticed while reading through those laws is that it started quite slowly, and then there was a sharp uptick in the amount of persecution that Jewish people faced. It got quite severe quite quickly towards the end. Now, what you might have noticed on your graph is a line curving upwards, depending on how severe it got towards the end of that persecution. Okay, so when we're talking about the Holocaust and people being rounded up and put into concentration camps, historians often are in two different schools as to why the Holocaust actually happened. There are two basic schools of thought. They're called intentionalism and functionalism. So intentionalism is one school of historical thought about the Nazis and the Holocaust. It indicates the idea that Hitler and the Nazis had always intended to imprison Jewish peoples and minorities in ghettos, concentration camps, labor camps, and extermination camps. So some people think that that was their plan from the very beginning. Functionalism, however, gives the idea that the mass killing of Jewish people had already started before this point, bit by bit, ordered by Nazi generals that were not Hitler on their own initiative. This theory states that eventually the higher up generals eventually accepted this approach as something that everyone would do. So functionalism basically says that, well, some generals were already killing the Jewish people, and basically it became an accepted practice higher up in the Nazi authority. So there's no neat answer to either one of those, but perhaps as a historian yourself, you'll fall down on one or the other side of that. Okay, so let's talk about ghettos. This word has been used a little bit in this lesson so far. So Germany invaded Poland in 1939. The Second World War began. With the invasion, Nazis started a program of rounding up the Jews from Polish and German towns. They were forced into particular areas of the country, often small areas of major cities which had walls built around them to separate the Jews from the Gentiles or non-Jews. So Jewish people, and the term Gentile is used for anyone who is not Jewish. The areas the Jews were forced into were called ghettos, and conditions in them were very, very tough. There was little sanitation and food was scarce. Each room held between 7 to 8 people. So there's often, in a large-ish room, there'd often be 2 or 3 families living in that one room. There was often very little plumbing, so flushing toilets, showers, that sort of thing would not be readily available. So awful conditions that the Jewish people are kept in. They're rounded up in these tiny spaces in cities, as you can see over here on the left-hand side. So, first of all, I'd like you to write your own definition of a ghetto before we do anything else. And what I find quite problematic about this is that we actually still use the word ghetto today. So, ghetto back then meant a walled enclosure around a certain area of a city in which many thousands of Jewish people were kept. However, in modern America and also in Britain, but to a less extent, a ghetto is referred to as part or parts of a city or town, especially a slum area that is occupied by a minority group. These days, its definition has changed slightly to mean a place that is created by poverty or pressures of society, such as race. So when people refer to a ghetto now, they're often referring to quite a poor area in a city, and that area is usually populated with different minorities. Perhaps it's quite telling to modern society that these areas have been given the same name that the Nazis gave to areas in which they imprisoned Jewish people and minorities, and may point to a deep racism ingrained in our societies. So whether they were called ghettos by politicians or by the people who live inside them, it doesn't matter that much. The fact that they're called ghettos points to perhaps the idea that people have been segregated there on purpose, which is why some people still use this word today. It's quite a worrying piece of language. Okay, so what I'd like you to do, just in the next 2 minutes or so, I'd like you to write your own definition of a ghetto, both a World War II ghetto and what we in modern Britain might call a ghetto. Okay, so we learned that many thousands of Jewish people would be kept in these walled areas of cities called ghettos. We now know how the word ghetto has changed its meaning slightly. Have some people, I prefer not to use it, but some people still use it to refer to poor neighborhoods in major cities occupied by minority groups. So, the Jewish people wouldn't be kept in the ghettos permanently. It was usually just a kind of temporary housing before the Jewish people are taken off to various different camps. So Hitler wanted to make a more permanent solution for the Jewish people that lived in Europe. On January 1942, leading Nazis met at the Wannsee Conference to plan what they called the final solution to the Jewish problem. This meant the complete extermination of all Jews under German control. The destruction of a particular race like this is called genocide, so killing of an entire people. To make this plan an action, the Nazi ordered camps of three main types to be built in remote areas of Eastern Europe. A concentration camp is a place where people are detained or confined without trial. Prisoners were kept in extremely harsh conditions and without any rights. Also, many were made to take part in forced labor, the result of which was often death, so that they'd often be worked to death in these forced labor camps. Railway trucks were prepared, timetables drawn up, and arrangements made for Jewish people to be rounded up from their ghettos and taken to these areas. Thousands helped, police, administrators, soldiers, and ordinary people, some of whom were not even German, so that there were normal German citizens participating in this extermination of Jewish people as well. You've got to ask yourself, well, why did they go along with this? And this is one of these problems that no one really has a neat answer to. Many people say it's something called mass hysteria or mass hypnotizing or something, where Hitler managed to get an entire nation of Germany to buy into his plan. It's quite worrying if one person can do that. How many times has that been replicated over history? Okay, it was not only concentration camps prisoners who were used for forced labor. By 1945, more than 14 million people were exploited in forced labor camps that stretched across the whole of Nazi-occupied Europe. Prisoners in the labor camps were kept in terrible conditions with the idea that keeping them like this would result in death. So not only were they worked to death, they were just kept there until they died, and there were some camps where they go there in order for them to be killed. The Nazis also built 6 extermination camps on Polish soil. After the Wannsee Conference in 1942, the Germans established death camps at Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Their sole purpose was murder. They were set up near railway lines to make transportation of the victims easy. So what we're seeing in this bottom right-hand corner, this is Auschwitz-Birkenau. You can see how the railroad tracks lead directly into the camp where the Jewish people would be offloaded, taken to some temporary accommodation, or perhaps straight to the chambers in which they would die. As they were purely killing centres, there were no selections. The victims were sent directly to the gas chambers. These extermination camps were sometimes part of bigger work camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, with which was the death camp attached to Auschwitz. So we hear the story there of millions of people being transported in by rail in order to face their death or to face forced labor or just to be confined and starved to death. And the most horrendous part of all of this is that there were many people who were outside of the Nazi German army who helped in this to happen as well. So railroad operators, police, administrators who did all the paperwork. So it's not just the Nazi German army. This was a collective effort from many people inside Germany, even citizens as well. So there are many stories of the kind of horrors that go on inside these concentration labor or extermination camps. One of them that I came across in my research is something called Sachsenhausen, which was a labor camp. In this labor camp, a particularly infamous thing happened where it was called the shoe walking unit, which was where groups of Jewish, homosexual, Romani, traveller, Sinti, and disabled people were used as forced labor to test different types of shoes, walking for many hours, sometimes up to 48 hours at a time on different surfaces like gravel, tarmac, to test just how durable these shoes were. This was all paid for by German companies. So there's a German shoe industry that paid the camp to do this, to force slave labor. And they actually made money off the findings that they got from these people marching around with their boots on. So using this research, they could figure out which shoe soles were the most durable, add that onto their products, and then begin selling them at a higher price because it's been researched. There were companies that actually made money off the forced labor of these Jewish detainees inside concentration and labor camps, which is an absolutely horrific thing to know about, but it is in fact true. Okay, so we've found out quite a few details about the different types of camps and why eventually people were sent to the labor concentration and extermination camps, and the two kind of different arguments for the Holocaust. Was it intention or was it a functional solution? What I find quite worrying about this final solution wording is that this brings about the idea that the very existence of the Jewish people was a problem, which is obviously quite a sickening idea to have, but one that was spread all across Nazi Germany at this point. So what I'd like you to do, if you have your booklet in front of you, there are 6 questions here. If not, you can answer them on a sheet of paper, which hopefully you have spare. I'm going to give you a few minutes to, perhaps you want to consult the reading in your booklet or rewind this video a little bit to review the information that we've been talking about so far. Give yourself a few moments to do that now. Okay, so let's look at some of the answers for this. Okay, this is all about the quote unquote final solution to the quote Jewish problem. So where did they meet in January 1940? They met somewhere called Wannsee. What was decided? They decided on the final solution. Again, very problematic wording. What does the final solution mean? Well, it meant genocide, the extermination of the entire Jewish people. It's worth noting as well, though, it wasn't just Jewish people. It was anyone who was recorded as being homosexual. So that means gay people and lesbians as well, bisexual, people who differently abled people. So that meant with physical or mental disabilities, differently abled, and it also meant traveler communities. Two particular traveler groups that were hit were called the Roma and the Sinti. So it wasn't just the Jewish. Yes, there were a massive chunk, about 6 million of them, but there were other minorities involved as well. The 3 main types of camps were the concentration, labor, and extermination camps. So concentration, they're just kept in one place, often starved to death. Labor, they were often worked to death. And extermination camps, they were taken there in order for them to be killed. So this one will involve far too many words for me to write onto this sheet, but I've just explained it to you there. Concentration camps are kept in one place. Labor, they're forced to work. In extermination, they are, well, killed there. Can you name one of the extermination camps Nazi-occupied Germany? Well, one of them from the reading was called Auschwitz-Birkenau. Okay, so this is where we're going to get to another piece of independent work, ladies and gentlemen. So in your booklets, you have this sheet here, and it says, can you create a poster to explain about the different types of camps used under the Nazis? So we've been discussing 3 different types of camps here. It's not going to be a very jolly poster, granted, or perhaps if you'd simply like to explain it in words, in a couple of paragraphs, if you think drawing these pictures might trigger you a little bit too much, I can understand that. So you might want to write down a definition instead. Either way, I'm going to give you a decent chunk of time in order to do that. Please pause the video now and have a go at that task. Okay, so we're now getting around to the end of the lesson where we begin wrapping up and reviewing what it is that we have learned during the lesson. So before we do that, though, I want you to figure out how much you guys remember just through the course of this lesson. So perhaps you want to do a little bubble, persecution of the Jewish people and the final solution in a little bubble. Do a quick mind map and see if you see how much you remember from this lesson. You might want to consult your notes only briefly, though. Okay, so let's have a look at this together then. So the Jewish people and also homosexuals, so gay, people who were gay, lesbian, or bisexual, and also the differently abled, so people with physical or mental disabilities, were rounded up as part of the final solution. They got together for a conference at a place called Wannsee, where they decided on something called the final solution to the Jewish problem. Again, very, very problematic wording there, but that is the way that they referred to it. People were put into concentration camps, so put behind bars. They were confined there in overcrowded conditions. It's often very, very cold as well, and they didn't have winter equipment, so many of them would freeze to death or die of malnutrition. There were also forced labour camps, so people like at the Sachsenhausen forced shoe walking unit to research what soles would go best on German army boots. People were walked and worked to death in many different contexts. And finally, there were, of course, the extermination camps, where 6 million Jewish, traveller, gay, lesbian, or bisexual, and differently abled people, so mentally and physically disabled people, were put to death. So that's ended my lesson on Jewish persecution and the final solution, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for tuning in. Tune in next time for How Did World War II End? I've been Mr. Windsor. Thank you for watching and listening.